But good question should be asked, what is hell? It's a great question. I'm a junior. I have a dad named David Sr. My students know a lot about my dad. I use him just about every sermon that I preach. And I even talked about him last Wednesday when I was up here. But my dad's a funny guy. He's a big dude. He was a tree surgeon his whole life. Before that, he worked on the railroad and just a scary-looking guy. I'm just not even going to lie about it. I was terrified of my dad when I was a kid, not only because of his temper, but just because of his physical build. But the funniest thing about my dad is that my dad doesn't know how to use syllables correctly. Like, he blends syllables together. Let me show you what I mean. If he would call me, like if I was in the back room, my name is David, right? He would say, David. See that? See how they all blended together? He'd be like, David. But somehow he gets all of them in there. And the funniest one was my mom, Mary, and he'd go, Mer. Mer. He'd get them all in there. But when my mom would say David, she'd get two answers all the time, right? So she'd be in the kitchen, and she would need something, and she'd say, David! And then I would be, hey. You know, she's like, no, little David. Like, they still call me little David. No, little David. Or I would come, she'd say, oh, no, big David. And she was talking about her husband. So that's kind of how we did it our whole life, little David and big David. And it could get confusing. And sometimes in Bible study, it can be the same way, confusing. The same word can be confusing. You may not know this or not, but the English language is really not a great language as far as interpretation power. Give you a great example. I love, more than I did before I moved here, but I love Mexican food, specifically Monterey on 5. That's just the jam. That's the place. I don't care what else you say, that's the place. In Douglasville, Monterey on 5. One reason, they're happy when we come. How many restaurants are happy when a church group of 20 show up? They're like, hola, come and sit down. You know, they're just so happy when we get there. That does a lot for me. But I love Monterey. Now, let me show you how English fails. I love Megan. See how it fails? See how it fails to make a distinction? How it fails? But we all know the difference. But the language fails. And so we have an English Bible that's been interpreted from Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic. And here's what's so interesting about the word hell. There are 3 Greek words with 3 totally different meanings for the one English word hell. And they're used in different ways. And usually if they are used in different ways, you'll see like a little number or letter in your footnotes. The 3 words are Gehenna, Hades, and Tartarus. Now, I want to bring a little bit of clarity to this, and I think you're going to be as amazed as I was the first time that I actually studied this out. Let me talk about the first word. It's called Gehenna. This is the word that is most used by Jesus in the New Testament. Before I tell you about that, let me tell you about something else. In the Middle East, near Jerusalem, right outside of Jerusalem actually, long before the time of Jesus and the time of Jeremiah, there was a field. And it was called the Valley of the Sons of Gehinnom. Okay? The Valley of the Sons of Gehinnom, or the Valley of the Sons of Ben-Hinnom. And the children of Israel, during the time of Jeremiah, gave into all types of idolatrous worship. More specifically, they gave into child sacrifice. They worshiped a god named Moloch. They'd go out into the Valley of Gehinnom. They would build this huge altar of their god with a hole in the middle. They would put a fire in the middle of it. And as a sacrifice to the god Moloch, they would throw their children in. And this is the story. This is where the story of Jeremiah 18 comes from. Where Jeremiah spoke about the potter's field. It's the potter's field. And he talks about how God is going to remold the children of Israel. And it's talking about their idolatrous worship to this god Moloch, where they're burning their children. And he says, I would have never told you to burn your children. That would have never been within my heart. That would have never been my command. And this was such an awful thing that was done here, they later called this valley the Valley of Slaughter. Now, fast forward to the first century in the life of Jesus, now the common tongue, the people, refer to this place just outside the city of Jerusalem as Gehenna. It's the same place. And it's such a wretched place that they've turned it into the dump, the heap, where they would throw carcass and feces and trash. And the dogs would go out there and they would eat at the bodies, and there would be weeping, gnashing of teeth there. They would take people out there to stone them to death. There was always a fire burning, so which that meant there was always a smell that was present when a good wind would come across the city. And that also meant that this is the place where worms were constantly eating at the carcasses. This was a wretched, cursed, terrible place with an awful history. It was the potter's field from Jeremiah 18. It was known as the Valley of Slaughter. And so when Jesus begins, as the great teacher that he was, to illustrate to people what hell would be like, he would say, Gehenna. He would use Gehenna as an eternal illustration of what hell would be like. It was the same way that he would say, look at this child, or look at this tree. He would say, look at Gehenna. If your right hand offends you, cut it off and throw it into Gehenna, rather than your whole body. Now, here's what's even more interesting about Gehenna. Jesus is betrayed by Judas for 30 pieces of silver. And the Bible says that he tries to return it back, and they don't take it. Just overridden with guilt and shame. We know the story that Judas went out and hung himself. But there's a very important line at the bottom of that story. It says that he hung himself in a field, and because it was cursed money, the leaders and religious leaders and Sanhedrin court men took the money he betrayed Jesus with and bought that field and renamed it the Field of Blood. It's the same place. The potter's field is the Valley of Slaughter. The Valley of Slaughter is Gehenna. Gehenna is the Field of Blood where Judas hung himself. Judas literally hung himself in hell. And they bought it with the money that Jesus was betrayed with. That's Gehenna. Hades is literally the grave. And you'll see this mentioned in a lot of different places. You may even see a side note on your cross references or your study Bible that say Hades is literally the grave. Now, Tartarus is a lot more interesting. You have to go all the way back to Genesis 6 or Job 1, or you have to look in 2 Peter 2 or Jude, because this is a collection of unclear text. In Greek mythology, Tartarus was the place where the Titans were locked in chains of darkness. And when you read in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 4, it says this, that God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell, Tartarus, and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until judgment. Now, Genesis 6 tells a story of these angels whose title was called the sons of God, and they were under direct authority of Satan. Job 1 tells the same story where the sons of God and Satan both appeared in heaven to God. And then Jude echoes these words of Peter, and you begin to see a picture drawn out where the angels who followed Satan in his rebellion, who took daughters of men as their wives, were judged by God in the flood and were placed in what is known as Tartarus, which is also synonymous with the abyss, the pit, the deep, which is mentioned in Revelations many, many times. It's the place where God has locked the angels who rebelled with Satan in gloomy chains of darkness, waiting until judgment. Now, I know that may be a bit confusing, but that is the literal place that's described within the Scriptures. That it's the place where the angels who followed Satan were placed. Now,